Chapter 43, Fathom justifies the proverb, "What's bred in the bone will never come out of the flesh." Some circumstances of this conversation made a deep impression upon the mind of our adventurer, who nevertheless concealed his emotions from the knowledge of his friend, and was next day introduced to that hidden treasure of which Rinaldo had spoken with such rapture and adoration. It was not without reason he had expatiated upon the personal attractions of this young lady, whom, for the present, we shall call Monimia, a name that implies her orphan situation. When she entered the room, even Fathom, whose eyes had been sated with beauty, was struck dumb with admiration, and could scarce recollect himself so far as to perform the ceremony of his introduction. She seemed to be about the age of 18. Her stature was tall, her motion graceful. A knot of artificial flowers restrained the luxuriancy of her fine black hair, that flowed in shining ringlets adown her snowy neck. The contour of her face was oval, her forehead remarkably high, her complexion clean and delicate, though not florid, and her eyes were so piercing as to strike the soul of every beholder. Yet, upon this occasion, one half of their vivacity was eclipsed by a languishing air of melancholy concern, which, while it in a manner sheathed the edge of her beauty, added a most engaging sweetness to her looks. In short, every feature was elegantly perfect, and the harmony of the whole ravishing and delightful. It was easy to perceive the mutual sentiments of the two lovers at meeting, by the pleasure that sensibly diffused itself in the countenances of both. Fathom was received by her as the intimate friend of her admirer, whom she had often heard of in terms of the most sincere affection, and the conversation was carried on in the Italian language, because she was a foreigner who had not as yet made great proficiency in the knowledge of the English tongue. Her understanding was such as, instead of diminishing, reinforced the prepossession which was inspired by her appearance, and if the sum total of her charms could not melt the heart, it at least excited the appetite of Fathom to such a degree, that he gazed upon her with such violence of desire, as had never transported him before, and he instantly began to harbor thoughts, not only destructive to the peace of his generous patron, but also to the prudential maxims he had adopted on his first entrance into life. We have already recorded divers instances of his conduct to prove that there was an intemperance in his blood, which often interfered with his caution, and although he had found means to render this heat sometimes subservient to his interest, yet, in all probability, heaven mingled the ingredient in his constitution, on purpose to counteract his consummate craft, defeat the villainy of his intention, and at least expose him to the justice of the law, and the contempt of his fellow creatures. Stimulated as he was by the beauty of the incomparable Monimia, he foresaw that the conquest of her heart would cost him 1,000 times more labor and address than all the victories he had ever achieved, for, besides her superior understanding, her sentiments of honor, virtue, gratitude, religion, and pride of birth, her heart was already engaged by the tenderest ties of love and obligation, to a man whose person and acquired accomplishments at least equaled his own, and whose connection with him was of such a nature as raised an almost insurmountable bar to his design, because, with what face could he commence rival to the person whose family had raised him from want and servility, and whose own generosity had rescued him from the miseries of a dreary jail? Notwithstanding these reflections, he would not lay aside an idea which so agreeably flattered his imagination. He, like every other projector in the same circumstances, was so partial to his own qualifications, as to think the lady would soon perceive a difference between him and Rinaldo that could not fail to turn to his advantage in her opinion. He depended a good deal on the levity and inconstancy of the sex, and did not doubt that, in the course of their acquaintance, he should profit by that languor which often creeps upon and flattens the intercourse of lovers cloyed with the sight and conversation of each other. This way of arguing was very natural to a man who had never known other motives than those of sensuality and convenience, and perhaps, upon these maxims, he might have succeeded with 9/10 of the fair sex. But, for once, he erred in his calculation. Monimia's soul was perfect, her virtue impregnable. His first approaches were, as usual, performed by the method of insinuation, which succeeded so well, that in a few days he actually acquired a very distinguished share of her favor and esteem. To this he had been recommended, in the warmest strain of exaggerating friendship, by her dear Rinaldo, so that, placing the most unreserved confidence in his honor and integrity, and being almost quite destitute of acquaintance, she made no scruple of owning herself pleased with his company and conversation, and therefore he was never abridged in point of opportunity. She had too much discernment to overlook his uncommon talents and agreeable address, and too much susceptibility to observe them with indifference. She not only regarded him as the confidant of her lover, but admired him as a person whose attachment did honor to Count Melville's choice. She found his discourse remarkably entertaining, his politeness dignified with an air of uncommon sincerity, and she was ravished with his skill in music, an art of which she was deeply enamored. While he thus ingratiated himself with the fair Monimia, Rinaldo rejoiced at their intimacy, being extremely happy in the thought of having found a friend who could amuse and protect the dear creature in his absence. That she might be the better prepared for the temporary separation which he meditated, he began to be less frequent in his visits, or rather to interrupt, by gradual intermissions, the constant attendance he had bestowed upon her since her mother's death. This alteration she was enabled to bear by the assiduities of Fathom, when she understood that her lover was indispensably employed in negotiating a sum of money for the purposes of his intended voyage. This was really the case, for, as the reader hath been already informed, the provision he had made for that emergency was expended in behalf of our adventurer, and the persons of whom he had borrowed it, far from approving of the use to which it was put, and accommodating him with a fresh supply, reproached him with his benevolence as an act of dishonesty to them, and, instead of favoring this second application, threatened to distress him for what he had already received. While he endeavored to surmount these difficulties, his small reversion was quite exhausted, and he saw himself on the brink of wanting the common necessaries of life. There was no difficulty which he could not have encountered with fortitude, had he alone been concerned. But his affection and regard for Monimia were of such a delicate nature, that, far from being able to bear the prospect of her wanting the least convenience, he could not endure that she should suspect her situation cost him a moment's perplexity, because he foresaw it would wring her gentle heart with unspeakable anguish and vexation. This, therefore, he endeavored to anticipate by expressions of confidence in the emperor's equity, and frequent declarations touching the goodness and security of that credit from which he derived his present subsistence. Chapter 44, Anecdotes of Poverty, and Experiments for the Benefit of Those Whom It May Concern. His affairs being thus circumstanced, it is not to be supposed that he passed his time in tranquillity. Every day ushered in new demands and fresh anxiety, for though his economy was frugal, it could not be supported without money, and now not only his funds were drained, but also his private friends tired of relieving his domestic necessities, nay, they began to relinquish his company, which formerly they had coveted, and those who still favored him with their company embittered that favor with disagreeable advice, mingled with impertinent reproof. They loudly exclaimed against the last instance of his friendship for Fathom, as a piece of wrong-headed extravagance, which neither his fortune could afford nor his conscience excuse, and alleged that such specimens of generosity are vicious in any man, let his finances be never so opulent, if he has any relations of his own who need his assistance, but altogether scandalous, not to say unjust, in a person who depends for his own support on the favor of his friends. These expostulations did not even respect the beauteous, the accomplished, the gentle-hearted, the orphan Monimia. Although they owned her perfections, and did not deny that it would be highly meritorious in any man of fortune to make her happy, they disapproved of Rinaldo's attachment to the fair beggar, made light of that intimate union of hearts which subsisted between the two lovers, and which no human consideration could dissolve, and some among them, in the consummation of their prudence, ventured to hint a proposal of providing for her in the service of some lady of fashion. Any reader of sensibility will easily conceive how these admonitions were relished by a young gentleman whose pride was indomitable, whose notions of honor were scrupulously rigid and romantic, whose temper was warm, and whose love was intense. Every such suggestion was as a dagger to his soul, and what rendered the torture more exquisite, he lay under obligations to those very persons whose selfish and sordid sentiments he disdained, so that he was restricted by gratitude from giving vent to his indignation, and his forlorn circumstances would not permit him to renounce their acquaintance. While he struggled with these mortifications, his wants grew more and more importunate, and his creditors became clamorous. Fathom, to whom all his grievances were disclosed, lamented his hard hap with all the demonstrations of sympathy which he could expect to find in such a zealous adherent. He upbraided himself incessantly as the cause of his patron's distress, took God to witness that he would rather have perished in jail than have enjoyed his liberty, had he known it would have cost his dearest friend and benefactor 1/10 part of the anguish he now saw him suffer, and, in conclusion, the fervency of his affection glowed to such a degree, that he offered to beg, steal, or plunder on the highway, for Rinaldo's assistance. Certain it is, he might have recollected a less disagreeable expedient than any of these to alleviate the pangs of this unhappy lover, for, at that very period he was possessed of money and movables to the amount of a much greater sum than that which was necessary to remove the severest pangs of the Count's misfortune. But, whether he did not reflect upon this resource, or was willing to let Melville be better acquainted with adversity, which is the great school of life, I shall leave the reader to determine. Yet, so far was he from supplying the wants of the young Hungarian, that he did not scruple to receive a share of the miserable pittance which that gentleman made shift to extort from the complaisance of a few companions, whose countenance he still enjoyed. Rinaldo's life was now become a sacrifice to the most poignant distress. Almost his whole time was engrossed by a double scheme, comprehending his efforts to render his departure practicable, and his expedients for raising the means of daily bread. With regard to the first, he exerted himself among a set of merchants, some of whom knew his family and expectations, and, for the last, he was fain to depend upon the assistance of a few intimates, who were not in a condition to furnish him with sums of consequence. These, however, gradually dropped off, on pretence of friendly resentment for his indiscreet conduct, so that he found himself naked and deserted by all his former companions, except one gentleman, with whom he had lived in the most unreserved correspondence, as with a person of the warmest friendship, and the most unbounded benevolence, nay, he had actually experienced repeated proofs of his generosity, and such were the Count's sentiments of the gratitude, love, and esteem, which were due to the author of these obligations, that he would have willingly laid down his own life for his interest or advantage. He had already been at different times accommodated by this benefactor with occasional supplies, amounting in the whole to about 40 or 50 pounds, and so fearful was he of taking any step by which he might forfeit the goodwill of this gentleman, that he struggled with unparalleled difficulty and vexation, before he could prevail upon himself to put his liberality to another proof. What maxims of delicacy will not the dire calls of necessity infringe? Reduced to the alternative of applying once more to that beneficence which had never failed him, or of seeing Monimia starve, he chose the first, as of two evils the least, and entrusted Fathom with a letter explaining the bitterness of his case. It was not without trepidation that he received in the evening from his messenger an answer to this billet, but what were his pangs when he learned the contents? The gentleman, after having professed himself Melville's sincere well-wisher, gave him to understand that he was resolved for the future to detach himself from every correspondence which would be inconvenient for him to maintain, that he considered his intimacy with the Count in that light, yet, nevertheless, if his distress was really as great as he had described it, he would still contribute something towards his relief, and accordingly had sent by the bearer 5 guineas for that purpose, but desired him to take notice, that, in so doing, he laid himself under some difficulty. Rinaldo's grief and mortification at this disappointment were unspeakable. He now saw demolished the last screen betwixt him and the extremity of indigence and woe. He beheld the mistress of his soul abandoned to the bleakest scenes of poverty and want, and he deeply resented the lofty strain of the letter, by which he conceived himself treated as a worthless spendthrift and importunate beggar. Though his purse was exhausted to the last shilling, though he was surrounded with necessities and demands, and knew not how to provide another meal for his fair dependent, he, in opposition to all the suggestions and eloquence of Fathom, dispatched him with the money and another billet, intimating, in the most respectful terms, that he approved of his friend's new adopted maxim, which, for the future, he should always take care to remember, and that he had sent back the last instance of his bounty, as a proof how little he was disposed to incommode his benefactor. This letter, though sincerely meant, and written in a very serious mood, the gentleman considered as an ungrateful piece of irony, and in that opinion complained to several persons of the Count's acquaintance, who unanimously exclaimed against him as a sordid, unthankful, and profligate knave, that abused and reviled those very people who had generously befriended him, whenever they found it inconvenient to nourish his extravagance with further supplies. Notwithstanding these accumulated oppressions, he still persevered with fortitude in his endeavors to disentangle himself from this maze of misery. To these he was encouraged by a letter which about this time he received from his sister, importing that she had good reason to believe the real will of her father had been suppressed for certain sinister views, and desiring him to hasten his departure for Hungary, where he would still find some friends who were both able and willing to support his cause. He had some trinkets left, the pawnbroker's shop was still open, and hitherto he made shift to conceal from Monimia the extent of his affliction. The money broker whom he employed, after having amused him with a variety of schemes, which served no other purpose than that of protracting his own job, at length undertook to make him acquainted with a set of moneyed men who had been very venturous in lending sums upon personal security. He was therefore introduced to their club in the most favorable manner, after the broker had endeavored to prepossess them separately, with magnificent ideas of his family and fortune that, by means of this anticipation he was received with a manifest relaxation of that severity which people of this class mingle in their aspects to the world in general, and they even vied with each other in their demonstrations of hospitality and respect, for every one in particular looked upon him as a young heir, who would bleed freely, and mortgage at cent per cent. Rinaldo, buoyed up with these exterior civilities, began to flatter himself with hopes of success, which, however, were soon checked by the nature of the conversation, during which the chairman upbraided one of the members in open club for having once lent £40 upon slight security. The person accused alleged, in his own defence, that the borrower was his own kinsman, whose funds he knew to be sufficient, that he had granted his bond, and been at the expense of insuring his life for the money, and, in conclusion, had discharged it to the day with great punctuality. These allegations were not deemed exculpatory by the rest of the assembly, who with one voice pronounced him guilty of unwarrantable rashness and indiscretion, which, in time coming, must undoubtedly operate to the prejudice of his character and credit. This was a bitter declaration to the young count, who nevertheless endeavored to improve the footing he had gained among them, by courting their company, conforming to their manners, and attentively listening to their discourse. When he had cultivated them with great assiduity for the space of some weeks, dined at their houses upon pressing invitations, and received repeated offers of service and friendship, believing that things were now ripe for the purpose, he, one day, at a tavern to which he had invited him to dinner, ventured to disclose his situation to him whose countenance was the least unpromising, and as he introduced the business with a proposal of borrowing money, he perceived his eyes sparkle with a visible alacrity, from which he drew a happy presage. But, alas! This was no more than a transient gleam of sunshine, which was suddenly obumbrated by the sequel of his explanation, insomuch, that, when the merchant understood the nature of the security, his visage was involved in a most disagreeable gloom, and his eyes distorted into a most hideous obliquity of vision. Indeed, he squinted so horribly, that Rinaldo was amazed and almost affrighted at his looks, until he perceived that this distortion proceeded from concern for a silver tobacco box which he had laid down by him on the table, after having filled his pipe. As the youth proceeded to unfold his necessities, the other became gradually alarmed for this utensil, to which he darted his eyes askance in this preternatural direction, until he had slyly secured it in his pocket. Having made this successful conveyance, he shifted his eyes alternately from the young gentleman to the broker for a considerable pause, during which he in silence reproached the last for introducing such a beggarly varlet to his acquaintance. Then taking the pipe from his mouth, "Sir," said he, addressing himself to the Count, "if I had all the inclination in the world to comply with your proposal, it is really not in my power. My correspondents abroad have remitted such a number of bad bills of late, that all my running cash hath been exhausted in supporting their credit. Mr. Ferret, sure I am, you was not ignorant of my situation, and I'm not a little surprised that you should bring the gentleman to me on business of this kind. But, as the wise man observes, bray a fool in a mortar, and he'll never be wise." So saying, with a most emphatic glance directed to the broker, he rung the bell, and called for the reckoning, when, finding that he was to be the guest of Rinaldo, he thanked him drily for his good cheer, and in an abrupt manner took himself away. Though baffled in this quarter, the young gentleman would not despair, but forthwith employed Mr. Ferret in an application to another of the society, who, after having heard the terms of his commission, desired him to tell his principal that he could do nothing without the concurrence of his partner, who happened to be at that time in one of our American plantations. A third being solicited, excused himself on account of an oath which he had lately taken on the back of a considerable loss. A fourth being tried, made answer, that it was not in his way. And a fifth candidly owned, that he never lent money without proper security. Thus the forlorn Rinaldo tried every experiment without success, and now saw the last ray of hope extinguished. Well-nigh destitute of present support, and encompassed with unrelenting duns, he was obliged to keep within doors, and seek some comfort in the conversation of his charming mistress, and his faithful friend, yet, even there, he experienced the extremest rigor of adverse fate. Every rap at the door alarmed him with the expectation of some noisy tradesman demanding payment. When he endeavored to amuse himself with drawing, some unlucky feature of the occasional portrait recalled the image of an obdurate creditor, and made him tremble at the work of his own hands. When he fled for shelter to the flattering creation of fancy, some abhorred idea always started up amidst the gay vision, and dissolved the pleasing enchantment. Even the seraphic voice of Monimia had no longer power to compose the anxious tumults of his mind. Every song she warbled, every tune she played, recalled to his remembrance some scene of love and happiness elapsed, and overwhelmed his soul with the woeful comparison of past and present fate. He saw all that was amiable and perfect in woman, all that he held most dear and sacred upon earth, tottering on the brink of misery, without knowing the danger of her situation, and found himself unable to prevent her fall, or even to forewarn her of the peril, for as we have already observed, his soul could not brook the thought of communicating the tidings of distress to the tender-hearted Monimia. Chapter 45, Rinaldo's distress deepens, and Fathom's plot thickens. Such aggravated misfortune could not fail to affect his temper and deportment. The continual efforts he made to conceal his vexation produced a manifest distraction in his behavior and discourse. He began to be seized with horror at the sight of poor Monimia, whom he therefore shunned as much as the circumstances of their correspondence would allow, and every evening he went forth alone to some solitary place, where he could, unperceived, give a loose to the transports of his sorrow, and in silence meditate some means to lighten the burden of his woe. His heart was sometimes so savaged with despair, which represented mankind as his inveterate enemies, that he entertained thoughts of denouncing war against the whole community, and supplying his own wants with the spoils he should win. At other times he was tempted with the desire of putting an end to his miseries and life together. Yet these were but the transitory suggestions of temporary madness, that soon yielded to the dictates of reason. From the execution of the first he was restrained by his own notions of honor and morality, and, from using the other expedient, he was deterred by his love for Monimia, together with the motives of philosophy and religion. While in this manner he secretly nursed the worm of grief that preyed upon his vitals, the alteration in his countenance and conduct did not escape the eyes of that discerning young lady. She was alarmed at the change, yet afraid to inquire into the source of it, for, being ignorant of his distress, she could impute it to no cause in which her happiness was not deeply interested. She had observed his strained complaisance and extraordinary emotion. She had detected him in repeated attempts to avoid her company, and taken notice of his regular excursions in the dark. These were alarming symptoms to a lover of her delicacy and pride. She strove in vain to put the most favorable construction on what she saw, and, finally, imputed the effects of his despondence to the alienation of his heart. Made miserable beyond expression by these suspicions, she imparted them to Fathom, who, by this time, was in full possession of her confidence and esteem, and implored his advice touching her conduct in such a nice conjuncture. This artful politician, who rejoiced at the effect of her penetration, no sooner heard himself questioned on the subject, than he gave tokens of surprise and confusion, signifying his concern to find she had discovered what, for the honor of his friend, he wished had never come to light. His behavior on this occasion confirmed her fatal conjecture, and she conjured him, in the most pathetic manner, to tell her if he thought Ronaldo's heart had contracted any new engagement. At this question, he started with signs of extreme agitation, and stifling an artificial sigh. "Sure, madam," said he, "you cannot doubt the Count's constancy. I am confident, he is certainly. I protest, madam, I am so shocked." Here he made a full pause, as if the conflict between his integrity and his friendship would not allow him to proceed, and summoned the moisture into either eye. "Then are my doubts removed," cried the afflicted Monimia. "I see your candor in the midst of your attachment to Ronaldo, and will no longer torment you with impertinent interrogations and vain complaints." With these words, a flood of tears gushed from her enchanting eyes, and she instantly withdrew into her own apartment, where she indulged her sorrow to excess. Nor was her grief unanimated with resentment. She was by birth, nature, and education inspired with that dignity of pride which ennobles the human heart, and this, by the circumstance of her present dependence, was rendered extremely jealous and susceptible, insomuch that she could not brook the least shadow of indifference, much less an injury of such a nature, from the man whom she had honored with her affections, and for whom she had disobliged and deserted her family and friends. Though her love was so unalterably fixed on this unhappy youth, that, without the continuation of reciprocal regard, her life would have become an unsupportable burden, even amidst all the splendor of affluence and pomp, and although she foresaw, that, when his protection should cease, she must be left a wretched orphan in a foreign land, exposed to all the miseries of want, yet, such was the loftiness of her displeasure, that she disdained to complain, or even demand an explanation from the supposed author of her wrongs. While she continued undetermined in her purpose, and fluctuating on this sea of torture, Fathom, believing that now was the season for working upon her passions, while they were all in commotion, became, if possible, more assiduous than ever about the fair mourner, modelled his features into a melancholy cast, pretended to share her distress with the most emphatic sympathy, and endeavored to keep her resentment glowing by cunning insinuations, which, though apparently designed to apologize for his friend, served only to aggravate the guilt of his perfidy and dishonor. This pretext of friendly concern is the most effectual vehicle for the conveyance of malice and slander, and a man's reputation is never so mortally stabbed, as when the assassin begins with the preamble of, "For my own part, I can safely say that no man upon earth has a greater regard for him than I have, and it is with the utmost anguish and concern that I see him misbehave in such a manner." Then he proceeds to mangle his character, and the good-natured hearers, concluding he is even blacker than he is represented, on the supposition that the most atrocious circumstances are softened or suppressed by the tenderness or friendship of the accuser, exclaim, "Good lack! What a wretch he must be, when his best friends will no longer attempt to defend him." Nay, sometimes these well-wishers undertake his defense, and treacherously betray the cause they have espoused, by omitting the reasons that may be urged in his vindication. Both these methods were practiced by the wily Ferdinand, according to the predominant passion of Monimia. When her indignation prevailed, he expatiated upon his love and sincere regard for Ronaldo, which, he said, had grown up from the cradle, to such a degree of fervor, that he would willingly part with life for his advantage. He shed tears for his apostasy, but every drop made an indelible stain upon his character, and, in the bitterness of his grief, swore, notwithstanding his fondness for Ronaldo, which had become a part of his constitution, that the young Hungarian deserved the most infamous destiny for having injured such perfection. At other times, when he found her melted into silent sorrow, he affected to excuse the conduct of his friend. He informed her that the young gentleman's temper had been uneven from his infancy, that frailty was natural to man, that he might in time be reclaimed by self-conviction. He even hinted that she might have probably ascribed to inconstancy what was really the effect of some chagrin which he industriously concealed from his participation. But, when he found her disposed to listen to this last suggestion, he destroyed the force of it, by recollecting the circumstances of his nocturnal rambles, which, he owned, would admit of no favorable construction. By these means he blew the coals of her jealousy, and enhanced the value of his own character at the same time, for she looked upon him as a mirror of faith and integrity, and the mind being overcharged with woe, naturally seeks some confidant, upon whose sympathy it can repose itself. Indeed, his great aim was to make himself necessary to her affliction, and settle a gossiping correspondence, in the familiarity of which he hoped his purpose would certainly be answered. Yet the exertion of these talents was not limited to her alone. While he laid these trains for the hapless young lady, he was preparing snares of another kind for her unsuspecting lover, who, for the completion of his misery, about this time began to perceive marks of disquiet and displeasure in the countenance and deportment of his adored Monimia. For that young lady, in the midst of her grief, remembered her origin, and over her vexation affected to throw a veil of tranquillity, which served only to give an air of disgust to her internal disturbance. Rinaldo, whose patience and philosophy were barely sufficient to bear the load of his other evils, would have been quite overwhelmed with the additional burden of Monimia's woe, if it had not assumed this appearance of disesteem, which, as he knew he had not deserved it, brought his resentment to his assistance. Yet this was but a wretched cordial to support him against the baleful reflections that assaulted him from every quarter. It operated like those desperate remedies, which, while they stimulate exhausted nature, help to destroy the very fundamentals of the constitution. He reviewed his own conduct with the utmost severity, and could not recollect one circumstance which could justly offend the idol of his soul. The more blameless he appeared to himself in this examination, the less excusable did her behavior appear. He tasked his penetration to discover the cause of this alteration, he burned with impatience to know it, his discernment failed him, and he was afraid, though he knew not why, to demand an explanation. His thoughts were so circumstanced, that he durst not even unbosom himself to Fathom, though his own virtue and friendship resisted those sentiments that began to intrude upon his mind, with suggestions to the prejudice of our adventurer's fidelity. Nevertheless, unable to endure the torments of such interesting suspense, he at length made an effort to expostulate with the fair orphan, and in an abrupt address, the effect of his fear and confusion, begged to know if he had inadvertently done anything to incur her displeasure. Monimia, hearing herself bluntly accosted in this unusual strain, after repeated instances of his reserve and supposed inconstancy, considered the question as a fresh insult, and, summoning her whole pride to her assistance, replied, with affected tranquillity, or rather with an air of scorn, that she had no title to judge, neither did she pretend to condemn his conduct. This answer, so wide of that tenderness and concern which had hitherto manifested itself in the disposition of his amiable mistress, deprived him of all power to carry on the conversation, and he retired with a low bow, fully convinced of his having irretrievably lost the place he had possessed in her affection, for, to his imagination, warped and blinded by his misfortunes, her demeanor seemed fraught, not with a transient gleam of anger, which a respectful lover would soon have appeased, but with that contempt and indifference which denote a total absence of affection and esteem. She, on the other hand, misconstrued his sudden retreat, and now they beheld the actions of each other through the false medium of prejudice and resentment. To such fatal misunderstandings the peace and happiness of whole families often fall a sacrifice. Chapter 46. Our adventurer becomes absolute in his power over the passions of his friend, and effects one half of his aim. Influenced by this dire mistake, the breast of those unhappy lovers began to be invaded with the horrors of jealousy. The tender-hearted Monimia endeavored to devour her griefs in silence, she in secret bemoaned her forlorn fate without ceasing, her tears flowed without intermission from night to morn, and from morn to night. She sought not to know the object for which she was forsaken, she meant not to upbraid her undoer, her aim was to find a sequestered corner, in which she could indulge her sorrow, where she could brood over the melancholy remembrance of her former felicity, where she could recollect those happy scenes she had enjoyed under the wings of her indulgent parents, when her whole life was a revolution of pleasures, and she was surrounded with affluence, pomp, and admiration, where she could, unmolested, dwell upon the wretched comparison between her past and present condition, and paint every circumstance of her misery in the most aggravating colors, that they might make the deeper impression upon her mind, and the more speedily contribute to that dissolution for which she ardently wished, as a total release from woe. Amidst these pinings, she began to loathe all sustenance, her cheeks grew wan, her bright eyes lost their splendor, the roses vanished from her lips, and her delicate limbs could hardly support their burden. In a word, her sole consolation was limited to the prospect of depositing her sorrows in the grave, and her only wish was to procure a retreat in which she might wait with resignation for that happy period. Yet this melancholy comfort she could not obtain without the advice and mediation of Fathom, whom she therefore still continued to see and consult. While these consultations were held, Rinaldo's bosom was ravaged with tempests of rage and distraction. He believed himself superseded in the affection of his mistress, by some favored rival, whose success rankled at his soul, and though he scarce durst communicate the suspicion to his own heart, his observation continually whispered to him that he was supplanted by his friend Fathom, for Monimia was totally detached from the conversation of every other man, and he had of late noted their intercourse with distempered eyes. These considerations sometimes transported him to such a degree of frenzy, that he was tempted to sacrifice them both as traitors to gratitude, friendship, and love, but such deliriums soon vanished before his honor and humanity. He would not allow himself to think amiss of Ferdinand, until some undoubted mark of his guilt should appear, and this was so far from being the case, that hitherto there was scarce a presumption. On the contrary, said he to himself, I am hourly receiving proofs of his sympathy and attachment. Not but that he may be the innocent cause of my mishap. His superior qualifications may have attracted the eye, and engaged the heart of that inconstant fair, without his being sensible of the victory he has won, or, perhaps, shocked at the conquest he hath unwillingly made, he discourages her advances, tries to reason down her unjustifiable passion, and in the meantime conceals from me the particulars, out of regard to my happiness and quiet. Under cover of these favorable conjectures, our adventurer securely prosecuted his scheme upon the unfortunate Monimia. He dedicated himself wholly to her service and conversation, except at those times when his company was requested by Rinaldo, who now very seldom exacted his attendance. In his ministry about the person of the beauteous orphan, this cunning incendiary mingled such awful regard, such melting compassion, as effectually screened him from the suspicion of treachery, while he widened the fatal breach between her and her lover by the most diabolical insinuations. He represented his friend as a voluptuary, who gratified his own appetite without the least regard to honor or conscience, and, with a show of infinite reluctance, imparted some anecdotes of his sensuality, which he had feigned for the purpose. Then he would exclaim in an affected transport, Gracious Heaven! Is it possible for any man who has the least title to perception or humanity to injure such innocence and perfection? For my own part, had I been so undeservedly happy, heaven and earth. Forgive my transports, madam, I cannot help seeing and admiring such divine attractions. I cannot help resenting your wrongs. It is the cause of virtue I espouse, it ought to be the cause of every honest man. He had often repeated such apostrophes as these, which she ascribed to nothing else than sheer benevolence and virtuous indignation, and actually began to think he had made some impression upon her heart, not that he now entertained the hope of an immediate triumph over her chastity. The more he contemplated her character, the more difficult the conquest seemed to be. He therefore altered his plan, and resolved to carry on his operations under the shelter of honorable proposals, foreseeing that a wife of her qualifications, if properly managed, would turn greatly to the account of the husband, or, if her virtue should prove refractory, that he could at any time rid himself of the encumbrance, by decamping without beat of drum, after he should be cloyed with possession. Elevated by these expectations, he one day, in the midst of a preconcerted rhapsody, importing that he could no longer conceal the fire that preyed upon his heart, threw himself on his knees before the lovely mourner, and imprinted a kiss on her fair hand. Though he did not presume to take this liberty till after such preparation as he thought had altogether extinguished her regard for Melville, and paved the way for his own reception in room of that discarded lover, he had so far overshot his mark, that Monimia, instead of favoring his declaration, started up, and retired in silence, her cheeks glowing with shame, and her eyes gleaming with indignation. Ferdinand no sooner recovered from the confusion produced by this unexpected repulse, than he saw the necessity of coming to a speedy determination, lest the offended fair one should appeal to Rinaldo, in which case they might be mutually undeceived. To his utter shame and confusion, he therefore resolved to deprecate her anger by humble supplications, and by protesting, that, whatever tortures he might suffer by suppressing his sentiments, she should never again be offended with a declaration of his passion. Having thus appeased the gentle Monimia, and discovered that, in spite of her resentment, his friend still kept possession of her heart, he determined to work an effectual separation, so as that the young lady, being utterly deserted by Melville, should be left altogether in his power. With this Christian intention, he began to sadden his visage with a double shade of pensive melancholy, in the presence of Rinaldo, to stifle a succession of involuntary sighs, to answer from the purpose, to be incoherent in his discourse, and, in a word, to act the part of a person wrapped up in sorrowful cogitation. Count Melville, soon as he perceived these symptoms, very kindly inquired into the cause of them, and was not a little alarmed to hear the artful and evasive answers of Ferdinand, who, without disclosing the source of his disquiet, earnestly begged leave to retire into some other corner of the world. Roused by this entreaty, the Hungarian's jealousy awoke, and with violent agitation, he exclaimed, "Then are my fears too true, my dear Fathom, I comprehend the meaning of your request. I have for some time perceived an host of horrors approaching from that quarter. I know your worth and honor. I depend upon your friendship, and conjure you, by all the ties of it, to free me at once from the most miserable suspense, by owning you have involuntarily captivated the heart of that unhappy maiden." To this solemn interrogation he made no reply, but shedding a flood of tears, of which he had always a magazine at command, he repeated his desire of withdrawing, and took God to witness, that what he proposed was solely for the quiet of his honored patron and beloved friend. "Enough," cried the unfortunate Rinaldo, "the measure of my woes is now filled up." So saying, he fell backwards in a swoon, from which he was with difficulty recovered to the sensation of the most exquisite torments. During this paroxysm, our adventurer nursed him with infinite care and tenderness. He exhorted him to summon all his fortitude to his assistance, to remember his forefathers, and exert himself in the imitation of their virtues, to fly from those bewitching charms which had enslaved his better part, to retrieve his peace of mind by reflecting on the inconstancy and ingratitude of woman, and amuse his imagination in the pursuit of honor and glory. After these admonitions he abused his ears with a forged detail of the gradual advances made to him by Monimia, and the steps he had taken to discourage her addresses, and re-establish her virtue, poisoning the mind of that credulous youth to such a degree, that, in all probability, he would have put a fatal period to his own existence, had not Fathom found means to allay the rage of his ecstasy, by the cunning arrangement of opposite considerations. He set his pride against his love, he opposed his resentment to his sorrow, and his ambition to his despair. Notwithstanding the balance of power so settled among these antagonists, so violent were the shocks of their successive conflicts, that his bosom fared like a wretched province, harassed, depopulated, and laid waste, by two fierce contending armies. From this moment his life was nothing but an alternation of starts and reveries. He wept and raved by turns, according to the prevailing gust of passion. Food became a stranger to his lips, and sleep to his eyelids. He could not support the presence of Monimia, her absence increased the torture of his pangs, and, when he met her by accident, he started back with horror, like a traveler who chances to tread upon a snake. The poor afflicted orphan, worn to a shadow with self-consuming anguish, eager to find some lowly retreat, where she could breath out her soul in peace, and terrified at the frantic behavior of Rinaldo, communicated to Fathom her desire of removing, and begged that he would take a small picture of her father, decorated with diamonds, and convert them into money, for the expense of her subsistence. This was the last pledge of her family, which she had received from her mother, who had preserved it in the midst of numberless distresses, and no other species of misery but that which she groaned under could have prevailed upon the daughter to part with it, but, exclusive of other motives, the very image itself, by recalling to her mind the honors of her name, upbraided her with living in dependence upon a man who had treated her with such indignity and ingratitude. Besides, she flattered herself with the hope that she should not long survive the loss of this testimonial. Our adventurer, with many professions of sorrow and mortification at his own want of capacity to prevent such an alienation, undertook to dispose of it to the best advantage, and to provide her with a cheap and retired apartment, to which he would conduct her in safety, though at the hazard of his life. In the meantime, however, he repaired to his friend Rinaldo, and, after having admonished him to arm his soul with patience and philosophy, declared that Monimia's guilty passion for himself could no longer be kept within bounds, that she had conjured him, in the most pressing manner, to assist her in escaping from an house which she considered as the worst of dungeons, because she was in it daily exposed to the sight and company of a man whom she detested, and that she had bribed him to compliance with her request, not only with repeated promises of eternal love and submission, but also with the picture of her father set with diamonds, which she had hitherto reserved as the last and greatest testimony of her affection and esteem. With these words he presented the fatal pledge to the eyes of the astonished youth, upon whom it operated like the poisonous sight of the basilisk, for in an instant, the whole passions of his soul were in the most violent agitation. "What," cried he, in an ecstasy of rage, "is she so abandoned to perfidy, so lost to shame, so damned to constancy, to gratitude, and virtuous love, as to meditate the means of leaving me without decency, without remorse? To forsake me in my adversity, when my hapless fortune can no longer flatter the pride and vanity of her expectation? O woman! 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 What simile shall I find to illustrate the character of the sex? But I will not have recourse to vain complaints and feeble exclamations. By heaven! She shall not escape, she shall not triumph in her levity, she shall not exult in my distress, no. I will rather sacrifice her to my just resentment, to the injured powers of love and friendship. I will act the avenging minister of heaven. I will mangle that fair bosom, which contains so false a heart. I will tear her to pieces, and scatter those beauteous limbs as a prey to the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air." Fathom, who expected this storm, far from attempting to oppose its progress, waited with patience until its first violence was overblown, then, assuming an air of condolence, animated with that resolution which a friend ought to maintain on such occasions, "My dear Count," said he, "I am not at all surprised at your emotion, because I know what an heart, susceptible as yours, must feel from the apostasy of one who has reigned so long the object of your love, admiration, and esteem. Your endeavors to drive her from your thoughts must create an agony much more severe than that which divorces the soul from the body. Nevertheless, I am so confident of your virtue and your manhood, as to foresee, that you will allow the fair Monimia to execute that resolution which she hath so unwisely taken, to withdraw herself from your love and protection. Believe me, my best friend and benefactor, this is a step, in consequence of which you will infallibly retrieve your peace of mind. It may cost you many bitter pangs, it may probe your wounds to the quick, but those pangs will be soothed by the gentle and salutary wing of time, and that probing will rouse you to a due sense of your own dignity and importance, which will enable you to convert your attention to objects far more worthy of your contemplation. All the hopes of happiness you had cherished in the possession of Monimia are now irrecoverably blasted, her heart is now debased beneath your consideration, her love is, without all doubt, extinguished, and her honor irretrievably lost, insomuch that, were she to profess sorrow for her indiscretion, and implore your forgiveness, with the most solemn promises of regarding you for the future with unalterable fidelity and affection, you ought not to restore her to that place in your heart which she hath so meanly forfeited, because you could not at the same time reinstate her in the possession of that delicate esteem without which there is no harmony, no rapture, no true enjoyment in love. No, my dear Rinaldo, expel the unworthy tenant from your bosom, allow her to fill up the measure of her ingratitude, by deserting her lover, friend, and benefactor. Your glory demands her dismission, the world will applaud your generosity, and your own heart approve of your conduct. So disencumbered, let us exert ourselves once more in promoting your departure from this island, that you may revisit your father's house, do justice to yourself and amiable sister, and take vengeance on the author of your wrongs, then dedicate yourself to glory, in imitation of your renowned ancestors, and flourish in the favor of your imperial patron." These remonstrances had such an effect upon the Hungarian, that his face was lighted up with a transient gleam of satisfaction. He embraced Ferdinand with great ardor, calling him his pride, his mentor, his good genius, and entreated him to gratify the inclination of that fickle creature so far as to convey her to another lodging, without loss of time, while he would, by absenting himself, favor their retreat. Our hero, having obtained this permission, went immediately to the skirts of the town, where he had previously bespoke a small, though neat apartment, at the house of an old woman, widow of a French refugee. He had already reconnoitred the ground, by sounding his landlady, from whose poverty and complaisance he found reason to expect all sorts of freedom and opportunity for the accomplishment of his aim upon Monimia's person. The room being prepared for her reception, he returned to that disconsolate beauty, to whom he presented 10 guineas, which he pretended to have raised by pledging the picture, though he himself acted as the pawnbroker on this occasion, for a very plain and obvious reason. The fair orphan was overjoyed to find her wish so speedily accomplished. She forthwith packed up her necessaries in a trunk, and a hackney coach was called in the dusk of the evening, in which she embarked with her baggage and conductor. Yet she did not leave the habitation of Rinaldo without regret. In the instant of parting, the idea of that unfortunate youth was associated with every well-known object that presented itself to her eyes, not as an inconstant, ungenerous, and perjured swain, but as the accomplished, the virtuous, the melting lover, who had captivated her virgin heart. As Fathom led her to the door, she was met by Rinaldo's dog, which had long been her favorite, and the poor animal fawning upon her as she passed. Her heart was overwhelmed with such a gush of tenderness, that a flood of tears streamed down her cheeks, and she had well-nigh sunk upon the floor. Ferdinand, considering this emotion as the last tribute she would pay to Rinaldo, hurried her into the coach, where she soon recovered her composure, and in a little time he ushered her into the house of Madame la Mère, by whom she was received with great cordiality, and conducted to her apartment, with which she found no other fault than that of its being too good for one in her forlorn situation. Here, while the tear of gratitude started in either eye, she thanked our adventurer for his benevolence and kind concern, assuring him that she would not fail duly to beseech the Most High to shower down blessings upon him, as the orphan's friend and protector. Fathom was not deficient in those expressions that were best adapted to her present turn of mind. He observed that what he had done was in obedience to the dictates of common humanity, which would have prompted him to assist any fellow creature in distress, but that her peculiar virtue and qualifications were such as challenged the utmost exertion of his faculties in her service. He said that surely heaven had not created such perfection in vain, that she was destined to receive as well as to communicate happiness, and that the Providence, which she so piously adored, would not fail, in due season, to raise her from distress and affliction, to that honor and felicity for which she was certainly ordained. In the meantime, he entreated her to depend upon his service and fidelity, and the article of her board being settled, he left her to the company and consolation of her discreet hostess, who soon insinuated herself into the good opinion of her beauteous lodger. While our hero was employed in this transaction, Rinaldo sallied forth in a sort of intoxication, which Fathom's admonitions had inspired, and, repairing to a certain noted coffee-house, engaged at chess with an old French refugee, that his attention, by being otherwise employed, might not stray towards that fatal object which he ardently wished to forget. But, unluckily for him, he had scarce performed 3 moves of the game, when his ears were exposed to a dialogue between 2 young gentlemen, one of whom asked the other if he would go and see the orphan acted at one of the theatres, observing, as a farther inducement, that the part of Monimia would be performed by a young gentlewoman who had never appeared on the stage. At mention of that name, Rinaldo started, for though it did not properly belong to his orphan, it was the appellation by which she had been distinguished ever since her separation from her father's house, and therefore it recalled her to his imagination in the most interesting point of view. Though he endeavored to expel the image, by a closer application to his play, every now and then it intruded upon his fancy, and at each return made a stronger impression, so that he found himself in the situation of an unfortunate bark stranded upon some hidden rock, which, when the wind begins to blow, feels every succeeding wave more boisterous than the former, until, with irresistible fury, they surmount her deck, sweep everything before them, and dash her all to pieces. The refugee had observed his first emotion, which he attributed to an unforeseen advantage he himself had gained over the Hungarian, but seeing him, in the sequel, bite his lip, roll his eyes, groan, writhe his body, ejaculate incoherent curses, and neglect his game, the Huguenot concluded that he was mad, and being seized with terror and dismay, got up and scampered off, without ceremony or hesitation. Melville, thus left to the horrors of his own thought, which tortured him with the apprehension of losing Monimia forever, could no longer combat that suggestion, but ran homewards with all the speed he could exert, in order to prevent her retreat. When he crossed the threshold, he was struck with such a damp of presaging fear, that he durst not in person approach her apartment, nor even, by questioning the servant, inform himself of the particulars he wanted to know. Yet his suspense becoming more insupportable than his fear, he rushed from room to room in quest of that which was not to be found, and, seeing Monimia's chamber door open, entered the deserted temple in a state of distraction, calling aloud upon her name. All was silent, solitary, and woeful. "She is gone," he cried, shedding a flood of tears, "she is forever lost, and all my hopes of happiness are fled." So saying, he sunk upon that couch on which Monimia had oft reposed, and abandoned himself to all the excess of grief and despondence. In this deplorable condition he was found by our adventurer, who gently chid him for his want of resolution, and again repelled his sorrow, by arousing his resentment against the innocent cause of his disquiet, having beforehand forged the particulars of provocation. "Is it possible," said he, "that Rinaldo can still retain the least sentiment of regard for a fickle woman, by whom he has been so ungratefully forsaken and so unjustly scorned? Is it possible he can be so disturbed by the loss of a creature who is herself lost to all virtue and decorum? Time and reflection, my worthy friend, will cure you of that inglorious malady. And the future misconduct of that imprudent damsel will, doubtless, contribute to the recovery of your peace." Her behavior, at leaving the house where she had received so many marks of the most delicate affection, was in all respects so opposite to honor and decency, that I could scarce refrain from telling her I was shocked at her deportment, even while she loaded me with protestations of love. When a woman's heart is once depraved, she bids adieu to all restraint, she preserves no measures. It was not simply contempt which she expressed for Rinaldo, she seems to resent his being able to live under her disdain, and that resentment stoops to objects unworthy of indignation. Even your dog was not exempted from the effects of her displeasure. For, in her passage to the door, she kicked the poor animal as one of your dependents, and, in our way to the apartment I had provided for her, she entertained me with a ludicrous comment upon the manner in which you first made her acquainted with your passion. All that modesty of carriage, all that chastity of conversation, all that dignity of grief, which she knew so well how to affect, is now entirely laid aside, and, when I quitted her, she seemed the most gay, giddy, and impertinent of her sex. "Gracious powers," exclaimed Rinaldo, starting from the couch, "am I under the delusion of a dream, or are these things really so, as my friend has represented them? Such a total and sudden degeneracy is amazing, is monstrous and unnatural. Such, my dear Count," replied our hero, "is the caprice of a female heart, fickle as the wind, uncertain as a calm at sea, fixed to no principle, but swayed by every fantastic gust of passion or of whim. Congratulate yourself, therefore, my friend, upon your happy deliverance from such a domestic plague, upon the voluntary exile of a traitor from your bosom. Recollect the dictates of your duty, your discretion, and your glory, and think upon the honors and elevated enjoyment for which you are certainly ordained. Tonight let us over a cheerful bottle anticipate your success, and tomorrow I will accompany you to the house of an usurer, who, I am informed, fears no risk, provided 20% be given, and the borrower's life insured."